How does a bond forged in loyalty and friendship shatter into an act of sacrilege that echoes through centuries? In the heart of 12th century England, two men stood as titans. King Henry II, a ruler of immense power and ambition, and Thomas Becket, his brilliant, worldly chancellor and closest confidant. They hunted together, ruled together, and dreamt of a unified kingdom. But one fateful decision. Archbishop of Canterbury would ignite a firestorm. A servant of God who placed divine law above the king's command. Their friendship curdled into a bitter rivalry that divided a nation. It was a conflict destined for a tragic end, culminating in a moment of royal fury when a king's careless words became a death sentence. This is the story of how four knights, spurred by their king's rage, rode to Canterbury Cathedral to confront an archbishop, and in doing so, created a martyr and forever stained a crown with the penance of a saint's final stand. In the vibrant, ambitious court of 12th century England, an extraordinary bond was forged. It was a friendship that seemed destined to define an era, uniting the newly crowned King Henry II and a London merchant's son, Thomas Becket. 20 years his senior, Becket was everything the young, energetic king admired. Sophisticated, intelligent, and fiercely competent. Their connection was immediate and profound, a meeting of minds that transcended the rigid class structures of their time. They were more than sovereign and subject. They were companions in every sense. They hunted together in the royal forests, their laughter echoing through the ancient oaks. They shared long nights debating philosophy, politics, and the future of the kingdom, their discussions fueled by wine and mutual respect. Becket's sharp wit matched Henry's restless energy, and his administrative genius brought order to the king's sprawling ambitions. For Henry, Becket was not just an advisor but a confidant, the one man he could trust implicitly in a world of shifting allegiances. This was the golden age of their alliance, a period of shared purpose and deep personal affection. A man whose loyalty seemed as unshakable as the stone walls of his castles. Neither could have foreseen that this very closeness, this perfect harmony of power and intellect, contained the seeds of a catastrophic rift that would drench the stones of a sacred cathedral in history, forever binding their names not in triumph, but in tragedy. Their story began in light, a testament to camaraderie, but was destined to end in the darkest of shadows. With his appointment as Chancellor in 1155, Thomas Becket became the second most powerful man in England. He was not merely an administrator, he was the king's alter ego, the executor of royal will. Henry II unleashed Becket upon the realm, and Becket reveled in the role. He was dazzlingly effective, reforming the legal system, levying taxes with ruthless efficiency, and reclaiming lands and castles that had been lost to the crown during the preceding civil war. His magnificence was a calculated reflection of Henry's own power. A moving spectacle of wealth and authority. You like Boulevard Emolver. Grand Forum Riamon. Yusuf. He commanded knights in battle, leading the charge in Henry's wars in France, and negotiated treaties with the cunning of a seasoned diplomat. In these years, his loyalty was absolute. The interests of the king were his own. If Henry needed money for his campaigns, Becket found it, squeezing it from barons and the church with equal impartiality. If a rebellious lord needed to be brought to heel, Becket devised the strategy. He was the hammer of the Angevins, and Henry was the hand that wielded him. This seamless partnership allowed Henry to consolidate his power over a fractured kingdom, creating a new era of centralized authority. For a decade, they were an unstoppable force, their ambitions perfectly aligned. Becket's service was so complete, his devotion so apparent, that Henry came to believe his friend's loyalty was a permanent feature of the landscape, as reliable as the rising sun. It was this profound, unshakable trust that would make Becket's later transformation not just a political problem, but a deep, personal betrayal. In 1162, the Archbishop of Canterbury died, and Henry II saw a golden opportunity. He would install his own man, his trusted chancellor and friend, in the highest religious office in England. With Becket as archbishop, the king believed he could finally bring the powerful and independent church to heel, asserting royal authority over its vast wealth and legal privileges. It was a masterful political stroke, or so it seemed. He pressured a reluctant Becket to accept the position, overriding the concerns of bishops and even his own mother, the Empress Matilda, who warned him against it. Henry was certain of his friend's pliable loyalty, but he had fundamentally misjudged the man he thought he knew so well. The moment the sacred vestments were placed upon Thomas Becket, a profound and shocking transformation occurred. The worldly chancellor vanished. In his place stood an ascetic, a zealous defender of the faith. He resigned the chancellorship, a direct snub to the king, who expected him to hold both offices. He traded his lavish silks for a simple monk's habit, worn over a coarse hair shirt that mortified his flesh. He gave his extravagant meals to the poor and spent his nights in prayer and study. This was not the political puppet Henry had intended to install. This was a man who had found a new master, a higher calling. Becket, once the embodiment of royal power, was now positioning himself as the champion of divine authority. The king, who had sought to unite the two great powers of his realm within one loyal friend, had instead set them on an irreversible collision course. The stage was set for a battle of wills that would shake England to its foundations. The central conflict that erupted between Henry and Becket was over a simple but profound question. Who held ultimate authority in England? The king or the church? For centuries, the English church had operated its own courts, judging clergymen for crimes ranging from theft to assault. This was the principle of benefit of clergy, and it meant that priests, monks, and clerks could evade the king's often brutal justice. To Henry, this was an intolerable affront to his sovereignty. He was determined to establish one law for all his subjects. For Archbishop Becket, this was an equally intolerable assault on the sanctity and freedom of the church, a freedom he had sworn to defend. The once inseparable friends now found themselves on opposite sides of an ideological chasm. Their arguments were no longer friendly debates over wine, but bitter public confrontations. When a canon was accused of a serious crime and the church court merely defrocked him, Henry was enraged. He demanded the man be handed over to the royal court for punishment. Becket flatly refused. He stood before the king, no longer the compliant courtier, but a prince of the church, arguing that no man should be tried and punished twice for the same offense. It was a clash of two absolutists. Henry, accustomed to total obedience, could not comprehend this defiance from the man he had raised from obscurity. Becket, now convinced he was a vessel of divine will, would not yield an inch of the church's God-given rights. The friendship was dead, replaced by a cold, hard animosity. Each man saw the other as a tyrant, one seeking to crush the church, the other to undermine the crown. The kingdom watched, holding its breath, as the two most powerful men in England prepared for a war without armies. The simmering conflict boiled over in January 1164 at Clarendon Palace. Frustrated by Becket's intransigence, Henry II convened a great council of the realm's most powerful barons and bishops. Here he presented a document of 16 articles known as the Constitutions of Clarendon. This was his master plan, a legal framework designed to formally curtail ecclesiastical privileges and subordinate the church to the crown once and for all. Clerics accused of crimes were to be tried in royal courts. No tenant-in-chief of the king could be excommunicated without his consent. Appeals to Rome were forbidden without royal permission. It was a systematic dismantling of the church's autonomy. Henry demanded that every bishop, including Becket, affix their seal to the document, swearing an oath to observe these ancient customs of the realm. Under immense pressure from the king and his fellow bishops, who feared a ruinous open war with the crown, Becket gave a verbal, qualified assent. But almost immediately, he was consumed with guilt. He saw his momentary weakness as a profound betrayal of God and his office. He sought penance from the Pope, who promptly absolved him and supported his rejection of the constitutions. When Becket formally repudiated the agreement and attempted to flee to France, Henry's fury knew no bounds. He charged his former friend with treason and embezzlement at a subsequent council in Northampton. Humiliated and fearing for his life, Becket escaped the court in disguise. He fled England under the cover of darkness, beginning a 6-year exile that would only deepen the animosity and set the stage for his fateful return. The 6 years of Becket's exile were a crucible, forging his resolve in the quiet cloisters of France. Initially sheltered by Cistercian monks at Pontigny, he embraced an austere life of prayer, study, and self-denial. This was not the flamboyant chancellor Henry remembered. This was a man remade, a spiritual warrior preparing for his ultimate test. From this sanctuary, he waged a relentless campaign of letters, appealing to Pope Alexander III and the courts of Europe. He framed his conflict not as a personal dispute, but as a universal defense of the Church's liberty against secular tyranny. Back in England, Henry grew ever more frustrated. His kingdom was stable, but the shadow of the exiled archbishop loomed large. In a calculated act of defiance in June 1170, Henry had his heir, Henry the young king, crowned by the Archbishop of York, a privilege belonging solely to Canterbury. This flagrant violation of ancient rights was, for Becket, an unforgivable transgression. The news struck him like a physical blow in his refuge at Sens. The friendship that had once defined his life was utterly extinguished, replaced by the cold calculus of power and principle. His exile was no longer a temporary retreat, but a period of strategic preparation. He was a shepherd gathering his strength to protect his flock, knowing full well the wolf was waiting. Every prayer and every diplomatic maneuver was a measured step back towards England, a step closer to the inevitable confrontation in Canterbury. His principles had become both his prison and his fortress. The solemn chants of evening vespers drifted through the cavernous stone nave of Canterbury Cathedral on the frigid afternoon of December 29, 1170. The air, thick with the scent of beeswax candles and cold incense, carried a deceptive peace that was about to be irrevocably shattered. 4 knights, their heavy chainmail clinking a dissonant rhythm against the monks' plainsong, burst into the sacred space. They were Reginald Fitzurse, William de Tracy, Hugh de Morville, and Richard le Breton. The kings were made flesh, a tempest of iron and fury unleashed by Henry's careless, heated words. They found Thomas Becket near the altar stairs, a solitary figure robed in white liturgical vestments, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to their violent intrusion. "Where is Thomas Becket, traitor to the king and the realm?" Fitzurse's voice boomed, the profane insult echoing off the high, indifferent vaulted ceilings. Becket did not flinch. He moved deliberately from the winding stair into the open, a shaft of fading afternoon light from a high window illuminating his face. "Here I am," he answered, his voice resonant and clear. "No traitor to the king, but a priest of God." "Why do you seek me?" The confrontation was swift and mercilessly direct. Martyr turned to Winchester to submit to the king's judgment. He would not abandon them to the wolves of the crown. Valthornimi himself, not from an earthly king. Enraged by his steadfast defiance, they lunged forward, attempting to physically drag him from the sanctuary, to commit their dreadful act on unconsecrated ground. But Becket, surprisingly strong for his ascetic frame, braced himself against a pillar, refusing to be moved. This was his church, his fortress of faith, and it was here he would make his final stand. The point of no return was crossed not with a shout, but with the chilling, metallic scrape of 4 heavy swords being drawn from their scabbards. The remaining monks scattered in terror, their prayers turning to panicked cries. Alone, surrounded by cold steel and hot fury, Becket bowed his head, commending his spirit to God and Saint Denis. As the first blade was raised high, glinting menacingly in the flickering candlelight, a political quarrel was about to be sanctified by the sacred sacrifice. A man was about to become a martyr. The Christmas court of 1170 was meant to be a display of royal power, but for Henry II in Normandy, it became a stage for impotent fury. The news had arrived like a thunderclap. Thomas Becket, from his exile in France, had unleashed his ultimate spiritual weapon. He had excommunicated the Archbishop of York and the bishops of London and Salisbury. Their crime? Presiding over the coronation of Henry's heir, a sacred right Becket fiercely claimed as the sole prerogative of Canterbury. This was not just an ecclesiastical dispute. It was a direct, audacious challenge to the very legitimacy of Henry's dynasty, a spiritual declaration of war. The king, a man of immense energy and pride, felt the sting of betrayal not just from his bishops, but from the man he once called his closest friend. Surrounded by his barons, the festive atmosphere curdled into one of dread as the king's infamous temper began to fray. He paced the stone floors, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. For 6 long years, this conflict had festered, a wound that would not heal. Now it had been torn open anew. Finally, Henry's control shattered. He reportedly threw himself to the floor in a paroxysm of frustration, chewing at the rushes that covered the stone. Then, rising to his feet, he unleashed the words that would echo through eternity, a cry of both anguish and accusation. "What miserable drones and traitors have I nurtured and promoted in my household," he bellowed, his voice raw with contempt, "who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born clerk?" It was a moment of pure, unrestrained rage. But in the tense silence that followed, 4 knights Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton heard something more than a king's lament. They heard an implicit order, a royal license to act. They saw an opportunity to win back the king's favor by permanently solving his greatest problem. Exchanging silent, knowing glances, they slipped away from the tense court. A king's reckless words had just become their sacred, bloody mission. Their journey to Canterbury had begun. The solemn chime of the Vespers bells rolled across the frosted fields of Canterbury, a serene call to prayer on the frigid afternoon of December 29th, 1170. But this sacred peace was about to be shattered. A second, more violent sound intruded. The harsh, metallic clang of armed men moving with grim purpose through the holy sanctuary. 4 knights, their identities forever bound to this dark deed, Reginald Fitzurse, William de Tracy, Hugh de Morville, and Richard le Breton burst into the cathedral nave. They were not pilgrims. They were the physical embodiment of a distant king's careless, furious words. Their chainmail and steel were a jarring intrusion in this house of worship. Terrified monks, their chants cut short, pleaded with their archbishop to flee, to seek safety in the crypts or to bar the doors. Thomas Becket, however, remained resolute. He had returned from exile fully aware of the peril, viewing this confrontation not as an end, but as a culmination. He would not hide. With a calm and deliberate pace, he proceeded toward the high altar, as if keeping a divine appointment. The knights intercepted him near the steps, leading to the choir, their menacing forms casting long, distorted shadows in the flickering candlelight. Their voices, raw with anger, desecrated the hallowed silence. They demanded he travel to Winchester, and reversed the excommunications of the bishops loyal to the crown. Becket's response was not one of a subject to his king, but of a primate to his flock. His voice, steady and clear, resonated with an authority that answered only to God. "I will not," he stated, his gaze meeting theirs without fear. He was a shepherd, and he would not abandon his post. The impasse was total, a symbolic clash between the temporal sword and the spiritual cross. Enraged by his unwavering defiance, the knights drew their weapons. The cold steel of their broadswords caught the light, and in that frozen moment, the fate of a man, a king, and a kingdom hung in the balance. The brutal finality of the act within the sanctified walls of Canterbury Cathedral sent a shockwave of profound horror across Christendom. This was not a political maneuver. It was a desecration, a violation of a sacred space that struck at the very heart of medieval faith. In Rome, Pope Alexander III was reportedly overcome with fury and grief. He immediately excommunicated the four knights, branding them as agents of an unspeakable crime. More devastatingly, he placed all of Henry's continental domains under an interdict. This spiritual lockdown was a terrifying punishment for the populace. Church bells fell silent, the sacraments were denied, and the dead were buried in unconsecrated ground. The gates of heaven, it seemed, were closed by royal command. Henry II, once the master of a vast Angevin empire, found himself a political and spiritual pariah, isolated and universally condemned. His thoughtless, angry words, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" had metamorphosed into a monstrous deed, unleashing a political and religious storm he could not possibly control. Publicly, he displayed extravagant grief, fasting and shutting himself away for weeks, but private remorse was an insufficient currency to appease the heavens or a vengeful papacy. To save his crown, his empire, and his immortal soul, a grand and humiliating public gesture was the only path forward. In July 1174, Henry made his penitential pilgrimage to Canterbury. He dismounted outside the city, removed his royal boots, and walked barefoot on the sharp, cobbled streets to the crypt that now housed his former friend's tomb. There, stripped to a simple sackcloth shirt, the most powerful king in Europe knelt before the tomb and submitted himself to be scourged by the assembled bishops and 70 monks. As the king's back bore the marks of penance, the martyr's legend was already taking flight. Miracles were reported at Becket's tomb almost immediately. In a remarkably swift process, Thomas Becket was canonized in 1173. A king's rage had created a saint, transforming Canterbury into a beacon for pilgrims, a lasting testament to a spiritual authority that even a monarch's sword could not vanquish.